Today we're going to talk about the High Middle Ages, which is really the end of the Middle Ages. And we're going to see how nations develop out of the feudal system that was in Europe during the Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages was a time when feudal monarchs in Western Europe moved towards increasing power over nobles and church, having a stronger and more centralized government. Remember, during the Middle Ages, the nobles had a lot of power, and they had loyalties to different people. We're going to get away from that, and we're going to go with one centralized government. And we're going to start to see the formation of nations that we know today. So what can we expect to see? Kings are going to strive to increase their power. Kings begin to raise taxes and maintain standing armies. As they get these taxes and the ability to have their own armies, they aren't going to need nobles anymore. One of the reasons you needed nobles and nobles' loyalty was because they were the ones providing the soldiers and providing the army. That's going to change. We're going to start to see the central governments get stronger, and we're going to see commoners identify with the king and country, not the local lord that they live with. So they're not going to be identifying with Normans and Normandy. They're going to be identifying with the French. They're not going to identify with Saxony in Germany. They're going to identify themselves as German. So that's going to start to change. We're going to start with England, though. We know that after the fall of the Roman Empire, Germanic tribes of Angles, Saxons, and Vikings invaded and settled in England. In 886, the Anglo-Saxon leader by the name of Alfred the Great was able to unite these kingdoms into one nation, which he called England, which we refer to today as England. These Anglo-Saxon kings are going to rule England for the next 200 years. Okay, so in 1066, the Anglo-Saxon ruler was King Edward the Confessor, and he's going to die, but he doesn't have an heir. So a group of nobles get together, and they're going to choose his brother-in-law, Harold, to be the successor to him. There was another person, William of Normandy, Duke William of Normandy, who was Edward's cousin, and he said, you know what, I'm actually the person who should be the next ruler of England. The English nobles didn't like that because William had been living over in Normandy in France for all this time. Remember, Normandy was the land that had been conquered by the Vikings, that the French gave to the Vikings because they didn't want to be invaded by the Vikings any longer. So, when William finds this out in 1066, he sails across the English Channel and he goes to war with the English to gain the crown of England. His army is going to defeat Harold. Harold, as a matter of fact, was struck in the eye by an arrow, and that's how he died. And on Christmas Day, he's going to be crowned King of England, William the Conqueror, King of England. Now, all the nobles that had been there before, he took their land and he gave it to Norman lords who were loyal to him. But he ends up keeping about 1/5 of the land for himself. So a lot of that land he keeps for himself. This is going to make him rich and give him quite a bit of power as the new King of England. There's William the Conqueror landing with his soldiers. Now, there were more soldiers than this, but remember the paintings during the Middle Ages were not that accurate. Here's William the Conqueror on his horse out in front of his army, and you can see he starts over in Normandy. Now, Normandy is, you might know the place Normandy if you've ever watched Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers. That's where Normandy is. That's where that war took place for World War II. So William the Conqueror comes across into England, ends up in London, and is made king. Now, when he becomes king, he's going to try to unify England. And the way he's going to do this is he's going to collect taxes from all these people. Before he can collect taxes, though, he needs to know what they have. So he creates something known as the Domesday Book. And this is a complete sentence of everything, okay? Every castle, every pig, every cow, every chicken, okay? Every piece of land, every mill, every shop, all gets written down in this Domesday Book. And he does that so that he can figure out how much to collect in terms of taxes. And it's going to make it much more efficient. He's also going to create a royal treasury. By having a royal treasury, he's going to have money of his own so he doesn't have to depend upon the nobles. That takes us to Henry II. He becomes king in 1154. He's going to establish common law, which was law based on earlier court cases. Henry saw the need to make sure that the law was common throughout the land as a way to bring the English people together. Common law is still used in England today. He's also going to develop a jury system based on 12 peers, so the noble's no longer going to be the judge. Judges are going to come in, and you're going to have a group of peers, and they're going to decide the case. Now, that's sort of what we use today in our court systems. He's going to send these judges to all parts of England to collect taxes, settle lawsuits, enforce punishments. He's also going to marry Eleanor of Aquitaine, which was another place in France, and it's going to give him land and a fief in France. Now, we talked about how the king starts to exert his power over not just nobles, not just commoners, but also the church. And Henry had a conflict with the church about where church members or church clergy, leaders of the church, should be tried. The Pope and the Catholic Church said, well, of course you try them in a church court because they're part of the church. Henry said, yeah, they should be tried in local churches. And he sort of got into an argument with his friend. His friend's name was Thomas Becket. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And when Thomas, his friend, had left, Henry was talking, and he said, man, if someone could do something about Thomas, he's driving me up the wall. And some of Henry's followers heard him and took that to mean that Henry wanted him to be killed. So these guys go and kill Henry, or go and kill Thomas, which is not what Henry wanted. But when you're a king, you can't just say things because people will do what you say. You got to be careful with what you say. All right, Richard the Lionhearted was a crusader, a hero during the Crusade. We'll find out more about him as we learn about the Crusades. He's going to leave his brother, Prince John, in charge when he goes to fight the Crusades. And eventually, when Richard dies, John is going to become the next king of England. Now, he was not a good ruler. He wasn't a good military leader. He lost so many wars, they called him John Softsword. So he lost Normandy to the French. He tries to get money out of his subjects by increasing taxes. That doesn't make him happy with his subjects. He fights with the nobility over taxes. He threatens the church. He threatens to remove charters. He's just not a very smart man, not a very good leader. So eventually, the nobles revolt and sit him down and say, all right, you're going to have to sign this. This is the Magna Carta. And it lists certain rights for nobles. The Magna Carta is the basis for many democratic governments even today. The Magna Carta means Great Charter, and it guarantees basic political rights to nobles. It's going to safeguard their feudal rights. In other words, the king can't just take their feudal rights away from them. Later on, the Magna Carta is going to be extended to all citizens. Essentially, the Magna Carta limits the king's power. According to the Magna Carta, the king must obey the law, consult his council before he makes decisions. The king cannot collect taxes unless approved by the council. It gives nobles the right to a trial by a jury of their peers. In other words, the king can't be the judge. And you can't just imprison someone because you've made the king unhappy. This is going to be a huge, huge influence on the U.S. Constitution. Next person we need to know about is Edward I. Edward needed to raise taxes for a war with France. So he calls together a meeting of the entire kingdom, not only nobles, but also clergy, knights, and burgesses. Burgesses were common citizens who were wealthy. And we start to see this rising class of wealthy commoners towards the end of the Middle Ages. And this is really the first legislative body in England. It's known as the Model Parliament. It's divided into two groups, the House of Lords, which has nobles and bishops, and the House of Commons, which has knights as well as burgesses, or these wealthy merchants. At first, it was a check on noble power, but eventually Parliament becomes stronger than the king, and it becomes a check on royal power. Here's a picture of the House of Lords. And the last thing we're going to take a look at is the War of the Roses. Now, this is going to be fought between two groups in England, the Yorks and the Lancasters. Richard III was a York. He's defeated by Henry Tudor, and that's going to start the Tudor dynasty in England. And Henry Tudor does some things to really help unify England and weaken the nobles even more. He's going to appoint advisors from the middle class, from that merchant class. He's going to use local governments more than he's going to use nobles. He's going to tax land, so that means by taxing land he can tax nobles. And he's also going to avoid war. So trade is going to increase and business is going to do well because people are working as opposed to fighting. These are just two pictures, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. And that's going to move us on to France. 1000 CE, France is divided into many small feudal territories. The first king of France is a guy by the name of Hugh Capet. He was like the count, the most important person in Paris, and they just chose him as the king. And the Capetian dynasty is going to last for about 300 years. At that point, the Capetian dynasty used heredity to determine who was going to be the next king. So the Capetian kings are going to expand their power and territory until eventually they're going to unite and control France. There are a couple Frenchmen we need to know about. Philip Augustus, or Philip II. He is the one who is able to take Normandy from King John the Soft Sword. He's going to establish royal officers called bailiffs who preside over the king's courts and collect taxes. Again, this is a way to weaken the nobles because they're no longer going to be running the courts. That's going to be the king's doing. But the most important thing Philip Augustus is going to do is he's going to create a standing army, and only that army and only the king are allowed to declare war and make war. So no longer can nobles fight each other. Only the king can do that. Next is Louis, or Saint Louis, Louis IX. He's going to create an appeals court which could overturn local judges' decision. Again, the local judge was often a noble, so this weakens the nobles. King Philip IV. He was fighting with the Pope over the right to tax priests, and he was trying to figure out how he's going to be able to tax priests. So what he does is he looks at England and he says, hey, that parliament they have actually weakens the different groups, so I'm going to do something similar over here. And he establishes the Estates General in 1302 to gain support against the Pope. And he thinks that he's going to be able to get the nobles and the commoners to gang up against the clergy. Okay, notice he has three groups in here. That way, there's always going to be two groups against one group, and it's going to create conflict between these three groups, and that's how he thinks he's going to be stronger. So here's the Estates General right here. You can see it looks a lot like what you saw in England. It's a little bit bigger than the Parliament, but it's the same general idea. Okay, this moves us on to Germany. After Germany fell, after Charlemagne, Germany fell apart into many small states. You can see all these little small states here. It's not one Germany, it's a bunch of little territories. In 936, Otto I of Saxony is able to take control of Germany, and he makes an alliance with the Pope and he is eventually crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Now, originally this works out real well, but we're going to see conflict between the German emperor and the Pope. They're going to fight over something called lay investiture. Now, the kings of Germany felt like they should be able to appoint German bishops, German church officials, and the Pope said, no, that's really a Pope thing. So they get in this big argument. Eventually, they come to a treaty, an agreement. It's called the Concordat of Worms. And what this does is it says that with you're no longer going to have lay investiture. The king can't do that. The Pope is going to appoint bishops, but the emperor could veto that appointment. So, in other words, they're going to have to come to a compromise that they can both agree upon. Okay, last couple we need to know about, Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II. They are going to continue fighting to gain more control of Italy. They lose a large battle at the Battle of Legnano. And the German princes are not happy about fighting all these wars. They sort of get rid of the emperor. And eventually the Holy Roman Empire is going to fragment under Frederick II because he was more concerned with Italy than he was with Germany. And Germany's not going to unify again until about 600 years later under a guy by the name of, oh my goodness, I forget his name. It'll come to me. Let's move on to Spain. Bismarck. Bismarck was the guy's name. You'll learn about Bismarck in World II. All right, Spain. There are two people that you need to know, Ferdinand and Isabel. Ferdinand was from Aragon. Isabel was from Castile. They're going to marry to unify Spain. You probably know them better as the people who paid for Columbus to come to the Americas. During the Reconquista, they're going to get the rest of the Muslims that were there, the Moors. They're going to get rid of them, and they're going to drive the Jewish people out as well. They're going to unify Spain through the use of the Inquisition, which forces all people to become Catholic, and they're going to expand their empire under Charles V. Okay, the very last thing we're going to talk about is the 100 Years' War. Now, this is important because it sort of leads to the official end of the Middle Ages. It's going to be fought between France and England over land, Normandy specifically. England was trying to regain land that they had lost to France earlier. Remember John the Soft Sword. For the first 75 years, things are going to go very well for England. They're going to win battles like Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt is probably the most famous. And they're going to do it by using the longbow, and I'll show you what that is in a second. So this Anglo-Burgundian area is the area that we're talking about they were fighting over. So here's the English longbow. It literally is a longbow. It was about 6 feet tall, and you could fire arrows very rapidly out of it. Now, it wasn't as strong as something like a crossbow, but with this longbow, you could fire 15 arrows per minute, okay, and hit them in at about 250 yards. Now, you don't even have to be accurate with this because you're going to have hundreds and hundreds of these, soldiers. Think about if you have, 200 of these soldiers, these longbowmen, shooting 15 arrows a minute. That's 200 times 15. That's like 3,000 arrows a minute. And what they would do is just shoot them in an area, and then they would all come down and they would land on somebody and don't even have to be accurate. They were so, impressive that later on historians refer to them as machine guns of the Middle Ages. So things are going really well for England until we get to 1429. A woman by the name of Joan of Arc, who was a French peasant, convinces the King of France that God had sent her to save France and drive the English out. She actually leads the French in battle and defeats the English at the Battle of Orleans. There she is, helping the French, being an inspiration. Interesting story about Joan of Arc, and you can see her here. She's tied to a stake, and they're getting ready to burn her. So she was caught by some French allies of England, the Burgundians, and given to the English. And the English try her as a witch, a heretic, someone who goes against the church. And notice what they do to witches. They're going to burn her at the stake. The interesting thing is the French king had an opportunity to get her back, to trade some English soldiers to get her back. And the French king was a little bit nervous about Joan of Arc because she was getting so powerful. So instead, he just let her get burned. The French are going to now be on the offensive, especially because they have a cannon, which they can use to knock down castle walls. The English didn't have cannons yet. By 1453, the English had lost all their territory in France, with the exception of the port city of Calais. So what happens because of the 100 Years' War? You get a sense of nationalism that's going to emerge, pride and loyalty to one's country. People now become French. People now become English. They don't call themselves Burgundians or Normans or people from York. They are English, or they are French. The power of the French monarchy is going to increase. The king becomes the national leader. Probably most importantly, though, knights are now ineffective, which means kings don't need knights anymore. And if you don't need knights, you don't need nobles. You can have your own soldiers, and that's what we see happening. The foot soldier, the longbow, and the cannon replace the mounted knight. So most historians consider this to be the end of the Middle Ages. The 100 Years' War is the end of the Middle Ages. The church is going to start to decline. Feudal system with its knights and castles are going to disappear. And we're going to see an economic revolution next class. And that's going to be the final step towards the end of the Middle Ages.